like to welcome Dr. Thomas Schneider, who was appointed this year as a Chief Executive of the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. He's a native of Germany and studied in Switzerland in Paris. He earned his degrees all in Egyptology from the University of Basel. And throughout his career, he has held academic and administrative positions in 4 global regions: North America, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And we are delighted to welcome you as a Chief Executive of APRU. And I would like you to invite you to give us a welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I just raised my hand so everybody sees me. Thanks so much, Melissa, for the very warm words of introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. So I'm really delighted to welcome you today to the opening of the APRU Global Climate Change Simulation 2023. Distinguished guests, expert speakers, facilitators, and most importantly, APRU students. Let me start maybe with the call to action by Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, who concluded his opening remarks at the 2022 Climate Conference in Egypt, COP27, with the following words. I quote him: "We need all hands on deck for faster, bolder climate action. A window of opportunity remains open, but only a narrow shaft of light remains. The global climate fight will be won or lost in this crucial decade, on our watch. One thing is certain: those that give up are sure to lose. So let's fight together and let's win, for the 8 billion members of our human family and for generations to come." That's Guterres. It is now beyond doubt that the future of our planet's ecosystem is under imminent threat, and that life on Earth is at stake. Many of the thresholds for keeping the average temperature rise below 1.5 degrees have already been crossed. We all bear responsibility to act. One of the ways to fulfill this responsibility is to gain the knowledge and skills to enter the arena of climate change negotiations and to commit ourselves to the common goal of combating climate change. In the words of Antonio Guterres, to fight together and to win. In this spirit, I welcome all of you and congratulate you on joining the 3rd APRU Student Global Climate Change Simulation. It is also a pleasure to welcome our speakers and partners from UN Environment, UN Migrant, the International Monetary Fund, Blue-Green Foundation, Rebalance Earth, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Thank you all for your support of this program and for sharing your insights. APRU is a network of 60 leading research universities across 19 economies of the Asia-Pacific. Since APRU was established in 1997 as an apolitical platform of dialogue and collaboration across the Pacific Ocean, this globe of ours has been transformed by demographic growth beyond 8 billion people, rapid urbanization, the digital revolution, and precisely climate change. International relations are no less complex than in 1997, and a global crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how suddenly things can change and how intertwined planetary problems have become. As we all know, the challenge of climate change is of a far greater order of magnitude. It requires international collaboration of an unprecedented level and scale. Key decisions taken at last year's COP27 show the importance of sufficient support and funding for developing countries, the need to hold business and industry accountable, and how imperative it is to ensure implementation of climate change mitigation at all levels. In the words of Antonio Guterres, we need, and I slightly rephrase his pronoun here, we need your hands on deck for faster, bolder climate action. So I urge you to enforce climate action across your universities and beyond the countries where they operate. I urge you to increase climate justice so that those countries that have benefited most from unrestricted carbon emissions have also the greatest responsibility to not only stop warming the planet, but to help those countries that have benefited the least, but are more likely to be suffering first and worst because of climate change. Essential to stopping climate change and building climate resilience is knowledge. How to advance the green economy, preserve the ecosystem, and mitigate extreme effects of climate change. Equally essential is the knowledge of international relations and the legal training to take on the carbon industry, to advance even, as some have proposed, an international law against ecocide. We need your commitment to bring about the political will for effective climate action. In this climate change simulation that we will be undertaking, you can practice how to make an effective case for combating climate change. I would like to conclude with expressing my gratitude to the exceptional teams at the University of Oregon, Professor Dennis Galvin and Ellie van der Rift, as well as the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes program, for supporting this new iteration of the climate change simulation. I would also like to thank the APRU Global Health Program and its director, Dr. Melissa Withers from the University of Southern California, who initiated the development of the climate change simulation in 2021 amidst the pandemic, and is our key lead of collaboration with the University of Southern California. My particular thanks go to all speakers, facilitators, and students from across 23 APRU universities. You dedicate your time and you offer your knowledge. Without your admirable support and commitment, it would not be possible to carry out this climate change simulation. And now, since we need your hands on deck for faster, bolder climate action, I wish you effective and impactful negotiations during the global climate change simulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider, for reminding us about our own responsibilities in addressing climate change. So we appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
And now I would like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Mozaharul Alam started his professional career at the Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies. He's also worked at the Ministry of Environment and Forests of Bangladesh. He attended climate change negotiations for more than a decade and coordinated the adaptation group of the G77 and China. In 2009, he joined the United Nations Environmental Program as a regional coordinator, climate change for Asia and the Pacific Office. His areas of specialization are in adaptation and low carbon development to climate change, integrating climate change into development planning and international relations. So I'm delighted to, and actually I was delighted to meet him in person about 2 weeks ago in Bangkok. So thank you so much, Dr. Lam, for being here with us.
Thank you, Malaysia, and thank you also, Thomas, for the opening words and also referring what our Secretary General mentioned in the last COP, highlighting the urgency to take action to address the climate change. So let me start sharing my screen to start my presentation. Okay. How to do the full screen? Sorry.
If I may, I think there's a button either at the top, that one, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much once again for inviting me to give this talk. The title of my talk is The Climate Change Negotiation. It is in a complex landscape. So what I'm going to talk about the UN resolutions, which basically define the climate change issues and what we are aiming to address, as well as the science behind it. I'll also talk about the objectives of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the governance structure of the Framework Convention, and I will make a couple of the final remarks. Now, let me start with the UN resolution on the climate change, on the Framework Convention on the climate change. Now, if we go back the 1987, where the UN General Assembly recognizes that the climate change has an impact on development, and when they took this resolution, the environmental perspective to the year 2020 and the beyond, that's the report, as well as another report that is very famous on the environmental issues, is the report on the World Commission on the Environment and the Development. These two reports played a critical role to actually conclude this UN, the General Assembly resolution. But if we also go back to the 1979, which was the first, the World Climate, the conference where the meteorologists came together and presented their initial findings, how the climate is changing, and they called for using the science to take action to address the changes as is happening and the likely impact to come. So it is not the discussion that we are doing today. It basically started even 4-5 decades ago. Now, following that—
Sorry, Dr. Alam, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Could we have you switch to the presenter, because there's a red block that says give subtitles a try that's blocking the wording, and we could also see your notes. So let's see, maybe could you go down to the bottom? Yeah, right there, I think that should do it.
Is
See if that does it.
Is that okay?
That removed the orange block, but we can still see the slide presentation.
Oh.
The next slides, the notes.
Oh, that I do not know how to handle.
There's a display settings at the top. Oops. If you go back to the slideshow.
Oh, okay. And then, because I'm seeing only my slide, I'm not seeing any other thing.
I think it's okay then.
No, it's okay.
My apology for that.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Okay. So based on that, the 1987, the resolution, the UN General Assembly took the resolution in 1988, which further recognized the climate change is a common concern of the humanity. And it has further determined that the necessary and the timely action should be taken to deal with the climate change with the global framework. And this is the point that I would like to highlight, is the agreeing under the UN General Assembly that we need a global framework. And that leads to the development of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But to develop that Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN has established a process to set up this, the framework, which we call the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, to negotiate this Framework Convention. And that the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee took 2 years of an hectic negotiation and ended with an agreed text for the Framework Convention on Climate Change on May 9, 1992. And then we all are very much known about this, the 1992, the 3 UN, the convention launched in Rio. And then we were very familiar on this, the Rio conventions, the way we know them. Now, in addition to that, what the UN General Assembly also decided to establish the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. And that is the science behind the Framework Convention and driving the discussion on the climate change issues. So if we look into the IPCC and their recommendation, is basically to provide the state of the knowledge of the science and the climate change, the social and the economic impact of the climate change, as well as the potential response the strategies and elements for inclusion in a possible future international convention on climate change. So this is how the climate change science is providing the input to the negotiation. And I strongly feel that this, as a university group, has a very strong role to play to bring the science and the findings to the table of the negotiation. Now, let me move to, as I mentioned, that they have finally agreed to the text and of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what are the two main objectives there? One is the stabilization of the greenhouse gas concentration at the atmospheric level. And that would, the concentration that they would like to limit or stabilize at a level that would prevent the dangerous anthropogenic interferences. And then what they have also agreed in that document, that such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow the ecosystem to adapt naturally to climate change and ensure the food production is not threatened and enable the economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So now if we carefully read the objectives of it, is then a CO2 concentration or the greenhouse gases concentration. It also talked about the time frame, but it didn't define the time frame because the science need to be there to define that. But also in terms of the development, it has a three clear areas to ensure. So with that one, let me move to the governance structure of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, if we look into the highest body in the Framework Convention is the Conference of the Parties, and that is the supreme body of the convention. And they actually finally adopt the decision under any of the discussion happening in the Framework Convention. Now, under that, what we also have a body to deal with the Kyoto Protocol, which we call the CMP in short.
Joshua representing India from Malaysia.
Someone is talking. Sorry, I thought that somebody is going to talk to me. Sorry for that. Now, what we also have is another body, which is the CMA. It's called the Conference of the Parties, serving as a meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. So we have the three bodies, which are the overarching body for the convention and the protocol and the agreement. Now, in order to organize the work, what we also have under the Framework Convention is the two subsidiaries bodies. One is scientific in nature and another is the implementation is nature. And in short, we call SubSTA, which stands for the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technical Advice. And then the SBI is the subsidiary body for the implementation, who looks into the effective implementation of the convention. So that is the structure. Now, in addition to that, let me just also try to mention the institutions that support the implementation of the convention and also provide the guidance to the Secretariat. So as I mentioned that we have the SubSTA and the SBI, but we also have the Bureau, as I also have mentioned that we have the COB, the CMP, and the CMA. Also, they have the Bureau in terms of providing them the guidance. Now, time to time, what they also create the different bodies and also the ad hoc working group. In the slide, what I'm showing is the CDM related the committees and the different bodies. Which started with the compliance committee, the CDM executive board, etc. But we'll be seeing the similar structure also coming under the Paris Agreement, under the Article 6, which is the market mechanism. We'll be also seeing the similar structure, which is under the Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage. So I'm just showing this an example that there are multiple bodies and the institutions, and they are all interlinked, and that creates another complexities in the negotiation because the multiple actors are engaged in this landscape. Now, if I move to particularly on the negotiation and the negotiating blocks, it is also the very complex and also it's in a dynamic issues. Now, under the convention, what we have is the Annex 1 and the non-Annex 1. In general, we can talk the developed countries and the developing countries, including the LDCs. But in terms of this, the Annex 1 and the non-Annex 1, the reason the countries has been divided under the two groups is the responsibility and the commitment that they hold. So particularly the Annex 1 countries is responsible for providing the finance, the technology, the support, etc. To the developing countries, including LDCs and the SIDS. Now, under that convention, what we also have is the 5 regional groups. And those regional groups are Asia, Africa, Central and Eastern European countries, the Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Western Europe and the other groups. So that is the geographical, the groupings under the convention. And that grouping is basically related with the Borough, the different group, the different committee that they formulate or establish under the convention or the protocol or the agreement. Now, in terms of the negotiation, we have the different setup and the different grouping. It is not the regional groups. So what we have in the negotiation is the G77 and China is the one group, though it is the G77 and China is basically more than 130 countries there. Then we also have the subset of the G77 and China and other countries is the AOCs. And then the LDCs, the EU, and then we have the umbrella group, we have the OPEC, also we have the other groups. And you will be seeing the new groups are also emerging in the negotiation. It's like the like-minded group, which is the one environmental integrity group. This is another group. What we also have in the negotiation is the observer organizations and media. They are primarily consisting of the environmental organization, the business organization, and the research organizations. So that is how the negotiation happened. And let me just mention you the very last the agreement we have in our hand to address the climate change, both the mitigation and adaptation, as well as the loss and damage, is the Paris Agreement. And if we look into the Paris Agreement, we have the different key building blocks. One is the objective, which is similar to the convention objectives, and it has reiterated that the common but differentiated responsibility will be followed in the Paris Agreement too. One of the things they have come up in the Paris Agreement is the nationally determined contribution, which is Article 3, and then we have the mitigation-related article. We have the article related to the NDC implementation, which is basically known as the market mechanism under the Article 6. And then we have the global goal on adaptation and the loss and damage, finance, the technology, and the capacity building. The reason I'm mentioning it, this is also another, the building blocks, and it also have its own the working modalities in terms of creating the contact group when they negotiate the particular aspect under each of the article. So under the Paris Agreement, it has also created number of bodies and the groups to negotiate the different aspect of these articles, as well as seeing the implementation of these articles. Now, I would like to just highlight, as I mentioned, that it created the different groups as a continued process of negotiation. This is an example of the loss and damage, which has decided the Santiago network, and that will provide the support in terms of the technical assistance, but also they will provide the funding. So this is the discussion how to set up that technical assistance program. So the discussion is happening, and also what the decision asked the developed country parties to provide the fund for that technical assistance. And what they have also established a Glasgow dialogue to discuss the arrangement of the funding activities, and they will be concluding in the 2024. So you will be seeing under each of the agenda that they will be negotiating the different aspects. As I mentioned that we have the groups, they're negotiating, and every group has their own views, and that creates the negotiation and reaching to an agreement. Now, if we look into also the COP related to the loss and damage, they have agreed to establish a fund, but to come up with the institutional elements, the modalities, the structure, the governance and the terms of reference of the fund, defining the elements of the new funding agreement, identifying and expanding the source of funding, and ensuring the coordination and the complementarity with the existing funding arrangement. So to all of those things, they have established a transitional committee to make the recommendation covering all the 4 areas. So you will be seeing in the upcoming negotiation, the lot of discussion on the loss and damage and how to set up the fund and where the fund will provide the support to address the loss and damage issues in the developing countries, including the LDCs and the SIDS. Now, I think I'm coming to an end of my talk. And I'd like to just highlight as a part of my final remarks, which I mentioned about the science behind it and how the scientific community is constantly providing the new information about climate change, both observed and anticipated. The changes is coming, bringing the evidences of the impact on the natural system, the human system, and the economic sector and the societies, and the overall implication on the development. And many of you may have seen the recent, the scientific, the research carried out at one of the US university on the methane and then how methane is not only tapping the greenhouse gases of the atmosphere, but also has its own cooling effect. So which will be the new area of incorporating in the science and the modeling work. And also they're providing the list of options how to deal with the climate change, both the reduction of the greenhouse gas and managing the impact. So science is playing a very, very important role in the climate change, not only the negotiation, but also addressing the mitigation and adaptation at the national level. The second one is the Framework Convention and the member state. They're also taking the collective decision at the international level. They're also talking and taking action, devising the mechanism to provide the technologies, finance, and the capacity building, but also reviewing the adequacy of the action. But if we look into the current state, it's basically the climate crisis is with us, and we need to scale up the action, or maybe we need to transform the action that we are taking. So without taking the transformative action, I think what the Thomas mentioned, quoting the Secretary General, the window is very small and it is narrowing down the faster. So we need to take action as quick as possible, and those has to be transformative. I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much once again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alam. This is Ellie Van de Grift, and we have a few minutes for students to ask questions. If you have a question, if you could type it in the chat, and then that'll give us an opportunity to share those and get some information. Right, wait just a minute, because we kind of dropped this on the students that they would have an opportunity to ask questions.
While we're waiting, could I ask a question?
Please do.
Since you have so much experience in terms of negotiation, and the simulation is really about negotiations, can you talk to us a little bit more about what are the biggest challenges in terms of negotiating across countries?
Okay, let me try. As I mentioned, if we look into the negotiating group, it is not only the difference in their opinion, but within the group, they also have the diversity in their opinion. For example, because I work with the G77 and the China group, insight as a part of the negotiation. If we look into that G77 group, a subset of the group is the AOCs or the SIDS. We have the LDCs, we have the African group. So the different group has their own priorities and they have their own need. And bringing the denominator of all the parties together is the biggest challenge. And also one of the biggest challenges among others, if any decision requires the funding support to provide to the developing countries. And that is one of the hardest negotiation in the negotiation of any decision that would require the financial support from the developed country to the developing countries. In terms of the technology discussion, you will often hear that who owns the technologies, who has the intellectual property right of the technologies. So that is another area of the challenge when talk about the technology to scale up. So it is in a diversity within the group, and finding a common denominator is a bigger challenge.
There's a question here from a student asking about the most important barriers, and you just kind of answered that. Are there any other barriers that you think that the student should keep in mind as they do this simulation of negotiations?
As I mentioned, that the science is clear, but it is one of the biggest challenge is not only the science which is giving us the picture of need, but it is the politics and the economics behind the politics is another challenge. So the political economy, I would request the students to keep that in mind. It is not only the science, it is not on the politics, but it is also the economic aspects of the politics.
Great, thank you. There's another question from a student about if you were at COP15, which I believe is the one in Montreal, and what were the biggest takeaways that you had from the failure of those negotiations?
If you are referring to the Montreal one, I don't think that Montreal one was a failure. But the Copenhagen, the people often talk about the failure of the COP. So the Montreal one is basically not the failure. That ratified the Kyoto Protocol when the Russia came on board before the Montreal COP. But if we look into the Copenhagen, where the expectation was very high to have a concrete decision covering both the mitigation and adaptation, including setting up the financing mechanism. So it was the balance between what the world was expecting to deliver and what the Copenhagen is basically failed to deliver that. But one of the good part that I'd like to mention about the Copenhagen is not the decision, but is in a consensus among the many parties to set up the $100 billion the fund, which is basically lead to the whole discussion on the 100 billion per year. It actually planted in Copenhagen, and that also established the Green Climate Fund. It is not completely failure, but it is between the expectation and what the Copenhagen has delivered.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to skip to another question, which is how do we foster collaboration in a world where countries have numerous different national interests, some of which are opposite to the direction we need to take with regard to climate change?
It's very interesting and the difficult one, as I mentioned, if we look into the negotiation. But in terms of the collaboration, I think what is important for us is to move away from the negotiation, because the negotiation has provided you the overall direction what the country needs to do. The country needs to find their partner, how they can actually make their development more pro-environment, and without compromising their development. So it is not the collaboration following what they have done in the negotiation and negotiating the collaboration at the international level, but it can be the bilateral level collaboration where they do see the interest and they will able to help each other. And one of the things which is happening is called the South-South cooperation. If you look into the ASEAN countries, any ASEAN countries who is taking some lead and showing some progress, the other ASEAN countries are also following that. So I think it is that kind of the collaboration is necessary within the smaller group of countries where they have the common interest and they're facing the common challenges.
So thinking about collaboration, here's another form of collaboration that's come up in a couple of questions, which is about the monetary component of some countries needing money and other countries giving money. Could you talk a little bit about that from both the perspective of both countries, those that might be offering monetary support and those that are receiving it? What are the challenges? What are the benefits of that?
Okay, there are three aspects there. One is the monetary support agreed at the international level under the convention that the developed country will be providing support to the developing countries, and they have established number of funding mechanisms like the JEF, the GCF, Adaptation Fund, etc. So that is the fund that we call the vertical fund. So that fund, the developed countries is providing resources, developing countries are accessing those resources. So that is the one source of the funding and how the countries are receiving that. The second area of the funding, which is under the market mechanism, and this is one of the mechanism through which the developed country and the business entities will able to transfer the technology, and those technologies will be allowing the reduction of greenhouse gases in the developing countries. And then the developed countries will able to use those as a credit. So it has inbuilt the financing mechanism, and the developing countries will get benefit in terms of the technology deployment, the scaling up, etc. The third area is the government, the bilaterally working, and those are the work that they're doing at the policy level, but also providing some support to see the benefit of the policy interventions. And then one of the things that we'll be seeing in the coming days is the whole discussion on the fossil fuel subsidy issues that the countries will be working together. We'll be also seeing in upcoming times the discussion on the phasing down coal or the phasing out coal, and a lot of collaboration will happen in those areas, both between the developed and the developing countries, and even between the developing countries, particularly in the region. If we look into the countries like China, Japan, Korea, they're investing a lot in the coal, but I think that is going to be another area of the collaboration, how to reduce the coal in the energy mix.
Great, thank you. I feel as though that has a lot of framework that works well in this particular simulation that the students will be working in. There's another question here about what would you say that these students should take to heart the most as they are thinking about representing the interests of a region or a group of countries or an individual country in this simulation? And we have purposefully put students into countries that are frequently not where they physically reside. Do you have any advice for our students as they step into somebody else's perspective for these negotiations?
In the negotiation, what you will often see that the emotion is coming. And the emotion is coming when you are residing in a country, okay? But as you will be representing in a country that you are not residing, so you have been assigned to, so maybe you will not able to show that emotion and the attachment which has both sides. It has the good side that you will able to do the simulation without putting your emotion, but using the science and the knowledge. But sometime in the negotiation, emotion is also important. So it has the both sides. So I'm just talking about the good side, that yes, you will able to do the simulation objectively and keeping out your emotion attached to that country and the people.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, which is actually a rephrasing of a question that a student has here, which is, how do you maintain your optimism and your hope for the future working in this really challenging area that has really dire consequences for us as an entire global community?
Yes, let me just give you my own perspective. Because when I started working in the climate change, it was in 1994. Started with the climate change, the assessment and the modeling, and then I moved to the negotiation. And obviously, I feel sometimes that what is happening is obviously not adequate, what the science is also telling us. But just remind yourself that if there was no discussion, no negotiation, maybe the situation could have been much worse than what we have. So that is what I feel and keep my optimism that yes, we still need to do more, but what we have done has some the significant output. It is not that the zero-sum game. We are making progress, but we need to make progress much more faster now.
Great. Dr. Alam, thank you so much for joining us today. If everyone could join me, you can use those reactions for the clapping if you want to join me that way or show it. Thank you so much for being with us today. There are more questions that we didn't get to. I'm going to put them in an email to you. And if there are some additional answers you might have time, I know that we would be grateful for that.
I'll be happy to do that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome to stay or pop off, whatever you need for today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Miriam Merchan, who is a member of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. She supports organizational efforts to position the value of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development contributions to society and to demonstrate that sustainable business can be a powerful force for societal good. She has worked for the United Nations, national decentralized governments in Central and Latin America, international government organizations, and global NGOs, managing regional networks and executing large-scale development projects and grants. And we're so glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you so very much for having me. Please bear with me while I share my screen.
Looks great.
Yeah, perfect. So again, thank you for the invitation. It is a true honor to repeat a session with this fantastic group. I'm very happy to see more than 150 students from across the world joining. Melissa and the team have been kind enough to invite me to this session to talk to you a little bit about the role of business in the larger context of these negotiations as an observer, which you just learned, but mainly to try and bring to you a perspective around whether or not business has anything to do with the health agenda, and then that link that is less known to many people around what the connection of health, climate change, and business is. So for my presentation today, and please allow me to put my timer so I do not steal more time than the one that I have been allocated. But basically, I've decided to do a little summary of what we are as an organization, also give you a very quick snapshot of what we represent and the role that business has to play or is playing in these conversations around sustainability, climate action. And that includes part of the conversation that you guys saw just minutes ago with the previous speaker, which is how to set up and advocate for a global agenda that tackles climate change. So I'll give you the perspective from business and why we're involved in that. And then I'll go down into what the agenda of business is in relation to health, why it is important, the role that we play, and hopefully show you a couple of examples that demonstrate that health issues and well-being is core to business and a strategic need for business. So to start the conversation speaking about WBCSD, I'd like to see if you guys, if there's anyone in this crowd that can tell me actually what WBCSD is, or if you know us. Just raise your hand or put something in the chat, anything that gives me an idea of whether or not you know what we are as an organization. Well, I see a lot of quiet faces there. And to be honest, the World Business Council for Sustainability was very foreign to me. For over 15 years, I worked with governments and the UN on these subjects for the other side of the front, which is collaboration and policy and project implementation. So it was quite refreshing to come into an organization that was led by business and that for once wasn't this very negative perspective of what bad business is, which is going into a geography, exploiting the resources, financial, economical, and natural, and then generating a value that is unique to shareholders and the business itself, but not for the communities. And that is actually why the World Business Council was created. We were established in 1995 as a result of about 15 companies joining these global conversations related to climate action, to the Kyoto Protocol, and in fact, the development of what we today understand as sustainable development as a concept. That came from the Brundtland Report and a request from the UN to talk to business and ask business to contribute to the agenda. The platform was created to respond to the challenges that were taking effect and that, as you have all experienced, have nothing but increased over the course of the last 30 years, but in particularly the last 15. In its inception, it was mainly looked as a perspective around how do we overcome resource restriction? But as the world has become more complex, as the needs have become more complex, business is understanding that it has to play a greater role in the development of society and the well-being of the future. So a community that started with 15 companies is today a strong organization, perhaps the second strongest organization led by business after the World Economic Forum, that galvanizes collective effort in a pre-competitive space. So you will see titans like Apple, Microsoft, and IBM sitting at the same table, looking for collective action and looking for solutions, as well as informing policy actors and other stakeholders from the global arena around what needs to be done from a more call it business perspective or practical perspective of one of the two largest influencers of the economy worldwide, the other one being nation states. What makes us a little bit unique with regards to other organizations is first that we are really CEO-led. So we are not an organization where companies come and give us their money and we affect projects. That is not our role. We bring members together to collaborate, to negotiate, to agree on a common background and framework of action, and where they make contributions that are aiming at creating scale. So we use and we leverage that expertise of sustainability that they bring to the organization to scale up and speed up the process of transformation, something that our previous speaker was raising to the table, which is we're not doing enough, we're not nearly doing it fast enough. Business is in a current process where it's really trying to address that gap in scalability through innovations, through their resources, through their financial clout, but also its global presence, because that is the advantage that it has to affect transformation. In addition to that, I think what has made us successful is understanding that business, whether it's a small enterprise or a large Fortune 500, is an organization that by nature is market driven. So our motto is, let's make sustainability part of the core of business and strategic to business, which means that by being sustainable, you can be a successful business. And by being sustainable, you can come up with solutions that are good for business, good for planet, and good for people. And I'll give you an example. If you take one of the leaders in this space, Unilever, the way that they see sustainability is really embedded in their purpose, in their business strategy. It's not, an office on the side that has been alienated from strategic decision making. The assets that they have as an organization are really pooled and leveraged to create solutions such as creating healthier products for their constituencies, for their clients, while also promoting saving costs, as well as, for example, creating new markets. Think of products as mouthwash that used to be only alcohol, and all of a sudden we are integrated communities from the Middle East, from Muslim communities that cannot intake alcohol, and all of a sudden we have a product that is alcohol free, and that it's now accessible to many other communities, a broader group, a broader market that wasn't available before. In essence, you are looking at the business concept that is also having healthier implications for the communities, because in practical terms, you're promoting more health, better habits, accessible habits for others. Any questions so far? And I know that we'll jump on those at the end, but I'm gonna give you a crash course of 5 years into 20 minutes. So please feel free to jump in. So give me a second because it's not changing the slides. Okay, so we are over 200 members that are led by a very specific mission and a very specific vision. So our vision is to achieve a world where 9 billion people live within the boundaries of the planet. And that we have translated into a strategic agenda where we achieve that change, accelerating that transformation through collaborating in a pre-competitive space. And the idea behind it is that we take these 200 members that you see on your slide, and we driving into sustainability-driven aspects of our content to affect change. That means that we have a portfolio of over 36 projects that are framed under 3 impact areas that we call imperatives: climate, nature, and equity. And these are in and of themselves attached to what we call pathways, which are systemic areas that the world must change in order to achieve that transformation. In our specific case, we're talking about climate change. These 11 areas have to be transformed in order for us to really reduce this and decarbonize and change energy and change health and other areas that I cannot touch on today, but that they are important not only because they achieve global transformation and well-being, but because they also affect the performance of business. So if you were trying to look into what business is trying to achieve, then you can see at the axes of this slide and look at aspects that impact negatively or positively a business based on their behavior. For example, decarbonization is critical for climate action, but if you think about the benefits of decarbonizing, you can also see that a company can get involved in energy efficiencies to avoid emissions or to reduce costs or to help their clients reduce their emissions and tackle issues of climate change that can impact their business. The way that the BCSD works, and it's important for your conversation right now, is to take these projects and really develop them not as a cookie cutter solution, but really based on the needs and the challenges and priorities of contemporary sustainability challenges. And that can be translated into many things. As you heard from the previous speaker, the business sector is only a part of non-state actors that have a huge impact in the global agenda. What makes us particularly different is that the cloud of the weight of companies, and if you think of WBCSD membership, we're talking about 9 trillion in assets, more than 7 million employees globally, outreach to more than 160 countries in terms of economical impact. There's a huge impact in there. And that does not mean necessarily only changing what the companies do, but how they work together and how they collaborate and agree and achieve a common framework of action to drive that change. And the 5 aspects that you see here outlined are the different ways in which our companies come to WBCSD to have us help them coordinate efforts and drive those solutions. And they range from establishing protocols, which I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. In the case of climate change, for example, WBCSD was the co-creator with the World Resource Institute of all the GHG protocol back in the day as a response to the Kyoto Protocol. And now we're involved in the process of studying that again and understanding how to fill the gap of things that we weren't aware in the past. So in the past, we were looking into, for example, emissions called scope 1, 2, and 3, the ones that 1 and 2, the ones that were issued by the company. Scope 2, I'm simplifying, but it's just to give you a general idea. Scope 1 being those that are within the operations of the company, Scope 2 being the ones that impact their supply chain, and Scope 3 being those that move more to the realm of you have an iPhone now, and how Apple as an Apple client is responsible for ensuring that you dispose of that iPhone or that you reduce the emissions that iPhone generates. That is the link there. Now, I think one big important aspect of this is understanding that this transition didn't happen overnight. This has been an evolution that actually tees up nicely with the historical evolution of what was presented before, because business action in the sustainability agenda, as I mentioned, started in the 1980s, and what traditional business and in general, I guess, academia, government, NGOs see from the space is that business vision towards the whole reason for business is to produce money and gain benefits for shareholders. And what we have seen over the past 40 years, but particularly over the past 15 years, is a huge push for businesses to be more responsible and to align their business to their purpose and to the greater good, right? So we see 2 different streams of type of businesses that evolve and that have changed, where some are more driven by shareholder value. So let's create money for our shareholders or investors, to a stakeholder value, which is more focused on our business is not going to succeed if the communities in which we operate do not succeed. Our businesses are not going to succeed if our employees are not happy. Our businesses are not going to succeed if our consumers are not buying our products because they don't believe in them. We're not going to succeed and have a safe operating space if simply regulations by government and the pressure of investors do not allow us to enter into different markets. And I think in understanding that aspect of how business as usual no longer works, and we need to see beyond that and move towards business as unusual, which is the type of leadership that our members have, we can figure out a way to combine what negotiations in the global arena represent and how business can contribute to the achievement of that arena. And if you have time and interest, you'll see that over the past 50 years in particular, business has been very active in understanding what happened to Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, the commitments that stem from Paris, and how to achieve 1.5 degrees as a milestone to ensure we've surpassed it. But in essence, our businesses are still looking into ways to address those issues, right? And in that context, and without getting too technical into it, is the fact that for business, it's very dangerous not to pay attention to this. And I'll give you a couple of examples. A company that is not legally responsible or socially responsible will end up facing fines or having to pay a considerable amount of money in order to address the harm that they have done. While in the past it was easier for business to not address this, it's no longer valid today. And for those based in the USA, a great example is what happened to a company in the railroad system that had a chemical accident recently. The train got derailed and chemicals were spilled. I don't know if you're familiar. I'll send you the notes for that. But chemicals got spilled, and they have right now a similar incident outside the US. So it's not only the liability of being accountable for the government and the accident and the cleanup, it's also the fact that because of that incident and the lack of responsibility around the safety measures that they needed to comply with, they now find themselves needing to invest huge amount of money in not only fines, liability issues because of residents in the community where they have polluted the water and the land, the health issues that they have caused and the way that they will have to respond to those issues, as well as the brand deterioration because they simply show that they couldn't be responsible in delivering those products, those chemical products to their destination. So these are the type of things that they need to be aware of, and the type of things that companies that are really looking beyond business as usual are paying attention to as members of the WBCSD. Now, as I had mentioned before, our vision is to have a world where more than 9 billion people live well within the boundaries of the planet, in a context where it is an opportunity for business to find those solutions. And what our members realized in that process is that we needed to have a focus on not an individual approach to climate and climate change, but also to include in that conversation the impacts of nature and the crisis in nature in terms of the deterioration of biodiversity and the lack of ability of nature to regenerate, given the impacts that it has on resources, as well as inequality. And the only way that I can explain why we see it as a connected issue, which may be useful for you because it has to do with the conversation of health, is the fact that one is dependent on the other. So if you think of the close connection that the pandemic had in terms of being triggered by a natural issue, a biological issue, immediately your memory triggers the shelter in place, the quarantine, the health impacts. But if you look more systemically, you would see that it had huge repercussions in terms of the sustainability agenda, because it contributed to generate housing insecurity, restriction in access to opportunities, loss in revenue and health for employees and families that saw their incomes impacted, but also problems in, for example, food accessibility, because the supply chains were disrupted. So a problem that was in nature a health issue became an emergency that had both political, productive, and economic implications, as well as social. So these three things are critical for us to put forward, because while I know that we're talking about the relationship between climate and health, and my role is to convey what that means for business, right now we're in an inflection point where we know that we cannot detach the three, and we need to create solutions to address the three. And the way that we've done that is through an agenda that, as I mentioned, has these different pathways of areas that need to be impacted by business and that need to be tackled in a collective and collaborative manner to ensure that the changes that take place in the world are sustainable and that we actually achieve our goals. Another example of that would be, for example, the connection between energy, mobility, the health of buildings, and the health of workers. If you think about facilities operating any equipment, producing any material, they usually are connected to the grid, which can be clean or unclean. It usually has an impact in the workers in terms of how healthy that space is, how clean and how sustainable the management of the water is, how clean and sustainable the management of the facilities is in terms of sanitation and waste, but also on mobility and the emission of GHG gases to the environment, as well as other gases, not restricted to CO2. So please don't limit it to that. But if you tackle the three in a systemic way and in a scalable way, reductions in emissions can be tied to efficiencies in energy and the use of clean energy, connections to cleaner options of mobility that also reduce emissions and that help leverage the energy generated by water or by mobility to maintain a healthier facility for workers, for example, and the communities around it. So there are a series of interconnections here that, in plain sight or by not being part of the process are harder to see, but once you think of it in terms of a strategy and how a business operates, become absolutely critical.
Miriam, just to do a time check, we're about 5 minutes over and we have a bunch of questions for you.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. And the crisis is that I've now entered into the most important aspect of the conversation. Could I steal 2 minutes from you to finish this?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay, and what we have seen now is that if you translate that into the corporate and health space, you see also the parallel in terms of traditional business seeing health only as a health and safety issue. Your classic behavior in an operating space where you want to reduce accidents and risks, but you're not really thinking about broader impacts to your ecosystem. And that's the big difference, because when you start thinking about the ecosystem, you understand that if you do not pay attention to health, you're not paying attention to the health of your customers, of your employees, of the communities in which you operate, you start losing the space and losing the capacity to sustain yourself as a business, as part of a community that creates growth, not only for the business, but also for the communities in which you operate. You do have access to the slides, so I'll make sure that any other questions are answered via email right away. And here, I'm not going to stop into this, but what I wanted to show was that connection that explains why business should pay attention to this. It's not a matter of only thinking about retainment of employees or retainment of customers. It's about the fact that it does have economic impacts that are felt by the communities, that are felt by the business, and that are felt by the economy. So this is a great example to show you how much impact a health issue can have in a community, and the ways that a company needs to get active and integrate these strategies into their business in order to address health issues caused by climate change. Now, if I may, I'll focus on what business can do, because everything else that I have said will reflect on this. If you have a business that understands that investing in global health reduces the costs for the business, for the economy, and for its employees, as well as its consumers, then there are greater chance that that changes into an opportunity to create benefits for the three of them, for the employees, for the company, and for the community. When a business produces well-being in the workplace, it is stated that that investment can unleash at least 70% of benefits for that place. When a business invests in better consumer lifestyles, then there are greater chances that the resources of that business are going to be maintained. And when a community invests, when a business invests in the community, then you have great examples of how that later percolates in GDP. Here I have 3 examples that are very relevant to the work that you hope you do when you think about the role of business in developing the sustainability agenda is well-being in the workplace. Think of PepsiCo and the policies they have in place to make it easier for mothers to work in the workplace. It reduces the stress for the mother. It reduces problems at home. It creates a better bond with their child because they are given childcare in the workplace, and it even contributes to increasing the opportunities of equality, gender equality, and inclusion for women. In terms of consumer lifestyles, if you think of a company like IKEA that introduces innovation to ensure that water is more efficiently used in the home by making that innovation affordable, then you're also saving money for those families by making sure that the water that it is scarce is also protected and better used. If you think about shifting the habits of eating of people in terms of consuming lifestyles, then you're impacting an industry, in this case, the dairy industry, the meat industry, reducing it, and therefore reducing the impacts that it has on the environment as well. Now, to finish, and apologies if I had to rush it, I've added to the slides 3 really good reports and sources that speak of that strong relation between business, health, and the impacts of climate change, and the type of actions that can be implemented both from a policy perspective in the global arena, which is why I brought COP, as well as in terms of strategies of sustainable lifestyles and business itself, and how it can change in order to promote health.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. And we have lots of questions for you. running out of time, but let me just jump to the first question that asks about some of the companies in the WBCSD or fossil fuel-based companies. What are some challenges these companies face in incorporating more sustainable practices? And since non-renewables form the bulk of their profit, how do they balance profit and sustainability?
Oh, that's a very long question. I'll try to do it as short as I can. Basically, the system has a series of pressures. In this case, you're talking about the risks of continuing in the fossil fuel industry. Most of the pressure comes from investors, but also from the consumers. I think that no one in this call, I'm almost positive that no one in this call knows that one of the biggest challenges for example, a company like GM, again, not in all industry, but you'll know where I'm going with this, is the fact that millennials and younger generations do not want to have a car, especially if that car is driven by petrol, by non-renewable sources. So that is forcing the entire system to change how it does things. Leading petrochemical companies, which include Chevron and Shell, are already working in what we call transition scenarios. And they're not ideal. They wouldn't make completely happy a Greta Thunberg, but it's basically the idea that they understand that they cannot change right now, but they need to. And that if they do not change, they're going to have something called stranded assets, which means assets of their companies that in 15 years, they will not have value because simply they cannot generate any type of revenue for the company. So there you see an economic pressure that is forcing these companies to move towards renewables. And if you look into their strategies, you'll see that they are all, the ones that are serious about it, committed to decarbonization strategies. Not perfect, but they're still committed to do it. And they're also working on a portfolio and scenario analysis that involves transitioning fully to cleaner technologies and cleaner fuels. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And then I guess our last question has to do with, does joining the council come with any commitments, requirements to shift business practices or emissions or supply chains so that consumers can be assured that these businesses are not contributing to widespread greenwashing in the market?
Yes. So any business that comes on board as a WBCSD member signs what we call a membership agreement, which includes conditions and criteria to join WBCSD. That criteria is based on the three imperatives, on those three blocks that I showed you guys on equity, climate, and nature, and includes commitment to net zero, so decarbonization in the climate front, reduction of nature loss and biodiversity loss, commitment to social justice and equity, commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the mechanisms to prove it. So transparency, disclosure, and reporting that supports and backs up that the actions that they're taking here is not just that commitment, but that there are ways to track it and see performance. All of our members abide to that, and all of our projects are geared to tackling problems that the companies have in advancing that agenda and helping them adhere to those criteria. Accountability is critical for WBCSD because ultimately, at this stage, and you'll see it if you go online, we've gone beyond greenwashing, we have greenwashing, we have other terms that have to do with companies that are doing what they're supposed to. They're not going fast enough, but are becoming afraid of not moving forward because they don't have the tools to prove it, and they will be punished for that.
Fantastic. Thank you. I know it's quite late where you are, but we so appreciate you bringing in the private sector perspective and hearing more about what you're doing as a council. So thank you for joining once again.
My pleasure. I'll stay briefly to check on the questions and see if I can answer them, and then I'll head to bed. It's quite late here.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. All right, so let's move on. Now we're going to talk about Simulation 101 and actually what does this entail here? So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dennis Galvan, who is Dean and Vice Provost for the Division of Global Engagement and is a professor of political science and global studies at the University of Oregon. A political scientist by training, Dr. Galvan has conducted extensive fieldwork in rural Senegal and in Indonesia. Also, we have Ellie van de Grift, who's a program director for global science education initiatives in the Division of Global Engagement at the University of Oregon. Trained as an ecologist, she has taught university-level life sciences courses, led STEM educational professional development programs, and supported curricular and pedagogical reform to improve students' learning experiences. So please take it away, Ellie and Dennis.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. Let's see. Tina, are you able to pin both me and Dennis? Or spotlight, whichever you would prefer. Dennis, do you want to talk so that you get moved up?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Melissa, for the introduction. Great to be part of the beginning of your amazing simulation journey.
Okay, Dennis, there you are. Okay, great. So Dennis and I have both taught courses that use some kind of simulation. I have taught one that had 100 students where we were looking at GMOs across the continent of Africa. I've also taught some that are place-based. I was in England teaching about cholera, for example. Dennis, what kind of simulations have you done?
Every year in my introduction to international development, students are assigned a role in the Popular Republic of Misericordia. You can look it up on Google. It's hard to find. And we do the country is under general strike, is about to have a coup d'etat. The IMF is chomping at the bit for repayment. There's civil war in various sectors, and the students are assigned a role in one of 9 social sectors to try and solve the national crisis and come to a new plan for governance and development. So it's kind of rolling, exciting chaos where they apply the lessons of an entire term to a real place in the world.
Great. And while you won't be doing this across an entire academic quarter or academic semester, over the next 2 weeks, you will dive into role-playing and simulation in the country or group of countries that you represent. So we wanted to give you some background on this role-playing and simulation because some students have experienced it before, but we have found in the climate change simulation that not everyone has before. So we've used the terms role immersion or role-playing. I saw on the introductions that some students have participated in Model UN before. That's also a version of this kind of simulation role-playing. In this work that you'll be doing together, the outcome of the simulation is guided, but it's not predetermined. And you will hear in just a few minutes from our colleague, Dr. Eby, who's going to describe the actual tool that you'll be using for the simulation and how you'll be inputting numbers that your delegation will be using through your negotiation. So we're going to encourage you to learn your roles. This is what you find on Canvas in your role sheet. We encourage you to rigorously prepare and then pursue your delegates' objectives. I asked our first speaker this question about how do you take on that role? And I thought his answer was really interesting about living in that place. So how do you imagine that you're living in the place and really embodying the heart and soul of the country or regions or group of countries you're representing? You as the students will determine the outcome with the interventions that you have with your room facilitators and the other students who are in the same room with you. So we have some questions that we're going to ask and answer for each other. And the first one is about learning through play. And I think, Dennis, you asked the first question, right?
Well, Ellie, yes. And, you know, don't forget that we've done this a little bit before, but we're also role playing right now. So we're trying to model how this works. So will this be academically challenging?
And the answer to this is yes. What we find is that these type of role-playing simulations are really academically rigorous. They can also be stressful for students if you feel like you don't have the full embodiment of that country and you might not understand, or if you're unclear about some part of the science or some part of the political nature of that country, that can be stressful at times. It can also be morally or emotionally challenging. We know that the topic of climate change is big. It encompasses many of our daily lives and the world around us and how we interact with each other. So we do want to acknowledge that and have you keep that in mind as you're going through the simulation. So Dennis, in addition to being academically challenging, can students learn about serious matters through play?
Absolutely. In fact, play may be the best way to learn about serious matters. Play doesn't mean in any way that we're making light of the gravity and urgency of this topic, as Thomas Schneider and other speakers have called out. Play or simulation by stepping into the role of someone else engages our minds and our hearts in the important issues by way of a shift of perspective. And if we as a species are going to survive the climate crisis, we very much need to learn to take the perspectives of others. So this kind of theater is incredibly important in this regard.
Oh, and there's one more for you. I think you just said this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad that bullet popped up. Because when you step into the role of someone else, you are trying to understand their world. And, you know, you may be inspired to work as an activist in this field in your career, but stepping into the role of a government official is going to be incredibly important because you'll be working with government officials or with officials in multilateral organizations, or as the last speaker just elaborated, folks in the private sector. So stepping into other roles is incredibly important. And it's a kind of deep learning that does more than just give you knowledge. It gives you emotional intelligence about the topic. And will playing a simulation create stress, as you kind of suggested before, Ellie?
And the answer is no. Based on the research that we know is that avoiding stressful issues can actually lead to greater stress. So instead of avoiding the issue of climate change, we're really tackling it head on. And role-playing this can make it easier to discuss and easier to solve. Sometimes it can take that own emotional that our first speaker was talking about. It can take our own emotional experience out of it so that we can really focus on the content and focus on the experiences and how do we have a negotiation. We do hope that across this simulation that there's a safe space where you can explore these ideas. And remember that the people who you're negotiating with are also students like you. Everyone here is learning, and all of you might be taking perspectives that are different than this perspectives you have as a human. We encourage you to find ways to process your ideas and your feelings. That might be that with your small group that you meet, that you want to set up a group, a WeChat, or you want to set up a WhatsApp and you want to talk to each other about what you're experiencing. It might be that you want to get together with the students at your university. We know some of the university students have already gathered for tea or for pizza. And part of that is so that you know that you're part of a wider community, not only this global community, but a local community as well. So what if the students, what if I don't agree with the goals of my delegation?
Well, that is okay. In fact, it's more than okay, because we know this is a space where there is tremendous lack of consensus. If there were consensus on the solutions for climate change, I don't think we'd already see the net increase in global temperatures and sea level rise that we've been seeing. So within countries, we know that there are big stakeholder disagreements. And of course, between countries and between multilateral organizations and countries, there are these disagreements. And these disagreements are actually the site of learning. And they're the site, of course, of negotiation. And so we all have to develop the agility of mind and the habit to step into unfamiliar roles so that we can anticipate how we're going to respond. So this is one of the reasons why I think a climate change simulation is so incredibly important, because I might be assigned to a delegation that I am sort of fundamentally in disagreement with everything that they stand for. And this is going to help me hone my position in relation to what that delegation thinks. And I'm going to come out of the climate change simulation a much better prospective negotiator with better understanding of how I'm going to convince people I disagree with, because I've been in their shoes, literally. So that's one of the amazing things about this that you just don't get unless you do a role play simulation. And what if we come up with the wrong answer, Ellie?
Well, there's no right or wrong answer here. We are trying to strive for a 1.5 degrees C increase, but you might not get there, and that's okay. Your goal is for deep engagement, for this deep learning that we've been talking about. Learn as much as you can from your faculty facilitators, from each other, this new global community that you have. We've given you lots of avenues for communication with each other on Canvas. You have each other's contact information. Use it, take advantage of that. How should students prepare?
Well, it is, as I think has already been mentioned, it's important to know your part. If you've done any theater work in your background, you know that you've got some lines, you've got a script. In this case, there's no script. This is improvisational theater, but you do have some context material about your delegation, about the society you represent, and of course, about the context. So bone up on that stuff, master that stuff, read the materials, watch the videos, and as has already been mentioned, pre-plan and pre-communicate with your delegation members. I think what you'll find is that there'll be moments when you say, hey, wait a minute, I'm stepping out of character. Like Ellie was saying, you were saying a moment ago, maybe when you really need to vent a little bit about your characters and you talk to people from your university. So notice these moments when you're communicating in character and outside of character, and start imagining yourself doing that, because that's how you're going to, one of the great ways to prepare is to rehearse for the eventual performance that's coming. And in terms of interacting on Zoom, how do we interact on Zoom, Ellie?
Well, you've already been taking advantage of the chat. You've been using your audio and video so we can see all of those nice flags, and you've been renaming yourself. But I like to have a pen. I like to have a piece of paper. I also like to have my phone so I can take notes as I'm going along, as I think of things. There's a whole stack of Post-its out of sight that you can't see. We're also soon going to go into breakout rooms, and we'll put the links for those breakout rooms in the chat. And that's where we'll be for the last little bit of our time together. And this will continue across the sessions. Thank you for your graciousness today, as we realized that we had the wrong Zoom links on the Canvas as well. That is also part of improv. And as the clowns say, ta-da! When you make a mistake, you just say, we made a mistake and everything is okay, because we're just going to move forward. Okay, so we're on Zoom. We're all across the world. We're across time zones. How do we meet, gather, talk with, secretly whisper to, or make deals with others in this space?
Well, there were a lot of learnings that came out of the pandemic. Then we were all doing courses and interacting on Zoom. So a few of them are on the screen, but I'm super confident that you're going to come up with your own ways of talking, gathering, secretly whispering, negotiating, nudging, cajoling, eye rolling, all the things that you need to do in a negotiation, the verbal and nonverbal communication. But, a full Zoom chat that we see here on the side is a bit like shouting across the room. And speaking on Zoom, which you should do, is a lot, is actually literally shouting across the room. Private Zoom chats function pretty well as moments to whisper. If we have on the side, a Canvas board discussion can be used as a small meeting, an email or social media chats can be used to create little caucuses, to have side meetings. So imagine, if this is all happening literally at the next COP meeting in United Arab Emirates, all of these things will be taking place. Hallway chat, drinks after the day's session with a small group of people, and those groups will kind of morph and transform. And to the extent that you can use the online media that we're all reasonably comfortable with now to simulate those kinds of gatherings, that is going to really augment this simulation and result in much more learning. So we really encourage you to be creative in this space.
Great. So for success, just to recap, understand your delegate's perspective. We encourage you to stay in character, interact, and negotiate with each other. Think, speak, act from your delegates' perspectives and also their interests. You'll also need to be flexible. Things might change in the moment, and so that's part of this experience too. The last two things here is that we hope that you will appreciate cultural differences, your own as people in this world, and the cultural differences of the groups that you may be representing, but also avoid cultural appropriation. So what that means is that you don't need to dress in any other way. You do not need to take on an accent that's not your own, but you just need to show up and be as authentic, representing the ideas of your delegation as possible.
And we will be communicating in English. And if English is your comfortable first language, it's important for those of us who are first language English speakers to make space, which means don't talk all the time, contribute, but don't monopolize, and slow down and try and speak clearly. And if English is not your first language, please do, of course, know that at any time you can ask for help, support, or translation. We're always available to help you with that.
Absolutely. So a last couple of final thoughts here. We hope you have fun with this simulation, getting to build your global network. Again, ask questions about anything that has come up. If you've emailed me and I haven't answered your question, I've just missed it. So email again, ask on Canvas. There's lots of different ways to ask questions. And then lastly, learn from each other and learn from the faculty experts and from our speakers. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you, Dennis, for joining me in this mock role play. I'm going to turn this over to Melissa in a moment, and then we will be going into the breakout rooms this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world, for a little bit of time to start to get to know each other. We'll hear a little bit about the simulation tool, and then I'll be back to give you the instructions about going into the breakout room. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on. We're a little bit behind schedule, but no problem. We have plenty of time at the end, and we have now really a fantastic introduction to the worksheet by a really world expert in climate change, Dr. Christy Ebi, who's been conducting research and practice on the health risks of climate variability and climate change for 25 plus years. Her research focuses on understanding sources of vulnerability, estimating current and future health risks of climate change, and many, many more related topics. So we are really fortunate to have you joining. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And let me share my slides. I'm going to be talking about the simulation worksheet and just want to give you some things to think about as you start filling in that worksheet. Here's what you need to fill in on the worksheet. I'm not going to talk about region. You all have your assignments. You all know what region you're talking about. you're going to need to fill in the peak year for greenhouse gas emissions, the year emissions reductions start. The earliest start date is 2023. You can't have emissions start reducing historically. It just isn't going to be possible in this worksheet. The annual reduction rate, the prevention of deforestation with a range from 0 to 100%. Afforestation, which is building new forests, again from 0 to 100%, with 0 is no change. BAU, by the way, is business as usual. And then contribution to or request from the Global Fund. The major one these days is the Green Climate Fund. I have some figures from Working Group 3. This is the working group in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that looks at mitigation. And it's provides some context for you to think about the answers you're going to come up with in each of your groups. This figure shows you the global net anthropogenic, human-caused, greenhouse gas emissions by region, going back to 1990. And you can see that there's been a steady increase in emissions. And the contributions, particularly from Eastern Asia, have been increasing significantly. And you can look at the percentages and see that there's been little change in Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, little change in the Middle East, and on down. Underneath, it shows the historic cumulative emissions. As we know, North America is responsible for most of the cumulative emissions. But Europe is catching up, and Eastern Asia is closing in, unfortunately. I won't do the other figures. They are all part of a figure in the summary for policymakers or in the chapter specifically on emissions in the Working Group 3 report. So then how do we think about the peak year and the year that reductions start? This figure is the kind of figure that is always in Working Group 3 reports. The figure on the left shows emissions from 2010 out to 2050. There is a legend at the bottom that tells you what those different colors mean. If we want to have warming at 1.5 degrees, it's the light blue shaded line. There's also overshoots, which we're not going to talk about, which is where you go above 1.5 and then come back. And you can see that there needs to be significant reductions by 2030 in order to stay below 1.5. And part of the simulation you're going to go through is going to show how hard that's going to be. And you need to make decisions to think about how you're going to try and help achieve that goal. There's something called the Climate Action Tracker. There's other NGOs that are tracking emissions. The Climate Action Tracker is useful because you can look up each individual country. I pulled up the United States. It gives a ranking for where things are. You can see the United States overall ranking is insufficient. And I want you to focus on the figure on the left. Again, they have these for all countries. And you can see historic in black. And then from 2020 going forward, you can see a range of possible options. The blue is current policies and actions that are planned. And you can see that this is ranked as insufficient, would lead to a world that's got about 3 degrees C of warming. Every country has a nationally determined contribution. These are the official documents from each country with their pledges under the United Nations Framework Convention on what their plans are over the next few years. And you can see that if the US decrease their emissions to be on target with what they have promised they're going to do, that the emissions reduction would be almost sufficient to have a less than 2 degrees C world. In the green, you can see the modeled 1.5 pathway. And we're not going to get into the fair share. We're just going to focus on the reductions. I found this quite useful in the context of the question here. Let me see if I can close this. I always forget. There we go. Sorry about that. If you look here at B, it gives the annual average greenhouse gas emission change over the last decade, 2010 to 2019. And the first thing that should strike you is how small those changes are. The United Kingdom reduced their emissions about 2% per year. The French, just under 2%. Germany, the same. United States, maybe 1%. You can see most countries increase their emissions. And so I encourage you to look at this in your groups, because we've seen in the past, there's groups that say we're going to have a 20% reduction in emissions. That just isn't possible. These kinds of figures are available in the Working Group 3 report of the IPCC. It's available at ipcc.ch. When you get to the landing page, go to reports, then look for Working Group 3 on mitigation. And as I said, you can look at the summary for policymakers in that report. You can also look at, there is a chapter on emissions. So I took these slides from both of those sources. We're not dictating how much you want to put down in terms of your emission reduction, but we're trying to bring a little reality to the situation of this is how countries have reduced their emissions to date. This is another slide that gets to the same point. This shows average annual emission change over the same time period. And again, you can see it's relatively modest. There's increases in emissions, particularly in Eastern Asia and the Middle East. And there are some reductions in emissions, but they're not large. And this is why there is a consistent call every year to say that we're not doing enough as a world, that the emission changes are quite small and more needs to be done if we want to stay at warming below 1.5 degrees. I also looked for figures about deforestation and afforestation, but the IPCC has moved on from focusing on that to focusing on agriculture, forestry, and other land use, because agriculture is critically important. There's a lot of emissions that come. And when you look at this figure, these are the global greenhouse gas emission trends by sector, where agriculture, forestry, other land use is in the dark blue. And you can see there's been some change over time from about 27% to 22%. So overall, a slight reduction in that. But again, the emphasis is on countries are not doing enough. This is historically what they have been doing. And to think about what it would take to have a much more significant reduction in emissions. Specifically on deforestation, another figure I found shows you all the variables that are associated with more or less deforestation. So when you're thinking about what to put down for deforestation, take a look at all of the factors that lead to less deforestation, law enforcement. That leads to questions about governance. And does the country have the kind of governance where you can do better law enforcement? Setting up protected areas, paying the poor communities who live around some of the areas that are being burnt down to stop them from doing so. And so you can look at the kinds of mechanisms that are associated with more or less deforestation and think in the context of your particular country or region, what you think might be the best guess. How far do you think that deforestation and afforestation can be pushed forward? And then finally, the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, that countries that are high income countries or upper middle income countries can make contributions to the Green Climate Fund. It's really focusing on trying to move billions of dollars of money. Countries that are low and low middle income countries can request funds from the Green Climate Fund for adaptation and for mitigation to find ways to help reduce their emissions. So there's quite a significant investment from the GCF into doing so. And so that's something else you need to think about, of whether you want to contribute to or withdraw funds from the Green Climate Fund. That is a little bit of an overview of the kinds of information you're going to have to put into your worksheets. And hopefully there's some questions.
Wonderful. And we put the link also to the worksheet. We have 2 rounds of pledges, so we'll start those next time. Are there any questions so far? Maybe people are not quite sure what questions to ask yet, but thank you for really breaking down those items and what to consider and what exactly they mean. So very helpful. Any questions?
You'll have the slides so that when you actually get around to making those pledges, you can go back and take a look at those, and you can take a look at some of the sources to see how helpful they can be with constructing your pledges.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here and helping us again with this. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, and good luck. I hope everybody really enjoys it.
We do. Thank you.
Oh, we've got a question now.
Thank you, Chris.
So the question is about the Global Fund. There's no figure particularly on that because it depends on if you want to contribute to or if you want to withdraw from. And so countries do pledge as part of their commitments to provide funds. The withdrawals from the Green Climate Fund depends. They've got lots of different funding mechanisms. They're all on the GCF website. And those can run into the tens of millions to, depending on what's being asked for, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Thank you, Chris, so much. It's lovely to see you again. But we are going to move into breakout rooms. We're going to do a quick group photo, though, before we do that. Tina's going to lead us in this.